Stalker 1 artifacts. Does Stalker 1 have better artifacts than Stalker 2? So in Stalker 1, a lot of the artifacts are just sitting on the ground, which is kind of weird because artifacts are considered to be very valuable. They sell for a lot to traders, and in most instances, they are just quite literally sitting somewhere, laying on the ground, and you can just grab them for little to no risk for pretty big reward because they do weigh almost nothing and sell for quite a lot. Now, in the case of the Hills of Garbage, there is a little bit of a risk. There's radiation on the hills, and there are like 3 to 4 artifacts per radioactive hill. So you can collect those artifacts and then sell them, of course. But weirdly, the artifacts on the hill aren't really better than the artifacts laying out in the fields. And as you saw earlier, that meat chunk I got in the fields next to no threats or danger was substantially less risky than just grabbing the thing where I'm taking tons of radiation damage and I need to chug anti-rads. So the risk versus reward in a lot of cases doesn't really make sense. Now, there are more artifacts in the hills than in the field in a way. Like, there are roughly like 10 to 12 artifacts just kind of laying around, not in the hills. So like, roughly speaking, you're like doubling the amount of artifacts if you pursue the hill artifacts. But the reward is, negligible at best. Now, if the artifacts were better in the radioactive hills, then that would be, good. That would be an example of rewarding the player for risking, doing this. But arguably, the risk versus reward factor in artifacts in Stalker 1 doesn't really make sense in a lot of cases if there is a risk factor, and in most cases, the artifacts are just sitting there on the ground for you to pick up for free. Now, in the case of other dangerous artifacts in Stalker 1, there is this 5 artifact spawn near extremely dangerous instant killing anomalies, and 2 of them can be grabbed safely without getting sucked in, and the other 3 can be bounced out with grenades. I did bounce them out poorly as they started to levitate again, and I was not able to recover the others, but it's just a bunch of meat chunks and souls, which are not really, super rare or super valuable anyways. So the fact that these are baked into this risk. Honestly, I kind of view this as a grenade puzzle, so it's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I like that there's 5 artifacts that are baiting you into a dangerous location, because that's kind of what we have in Stalker 2, where every single artifact needs to be found with a detector and is in a dangerous location. So I feel like this is kind of like an early version of that, or at the very least, baiting the player. All right, so for builds for Stalker 1, I basically ran this build with slight tweaks to it the entire game. I had Mika for bleed reduction. I had Urchin, which reduces bleed healing, but also reduces radiation, so that combos with other things. I used Stone Flowers for tanking, and then I would sub in a Flash for stamina regen, and also another Urchin for more radiation reduction. So the build was literally this the entire playthrough. Another thing to note about Stalker 1's artifact system is there's no lead container slots. There are also not that many artifacts that even cause radiation damage, and you can always have 5 equipped at any given time. So here is like the bullet cap version of that build, and then you have other artifacts that just like reduce different stats or give you tanking towards specific stats. But weirdly, there's no like artifact slots, there's no lead containers, none of that exists in Stalker 1. So generally, like, as soon as you start collecting certain versions of artifacts, you're good to go. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Stalker 2 artifacts. Getting artifacts in Stalker 2 is much more dangerous than picking up a thing on the ground near a tree. You have to actually maneuver through dangerous anomaly fields where you can easily die, and especially on veteran difficulty, in some cases get one-shot by those anomalies. And you have to locate the artifact with a detector, and there are different detectors that get better, that help you more as you get farther in the game, but generally you are risking dying while pursuing artifacts and equipment damage, which is a big deal in Stalker 2 because repairing is very expensive. So the closest thing we have to artifacts lying on the ground are hand-placed artifacts that are few and far between. So here's an example of a moonlight that's in this like radioactive, poison area that is currently killing me in a pretty huge way. Like, I'm literally almost dead just from being exposed to this environment. So there are artifacts that are safe to grab that are free, but there's like a handful of those in the game. Most artifacts are going to be associated with anomaly fields. And here we have like a more middle to end game artifact field where you have like a roaming electric orb that if it touches you, generally kills you in a single hit unless you have electric protection. and you also have a ton of ambient electrical, anomalies on the ground, so you have to watch out for those. So if you get touched by the orb and touch one of those, you will die for sure. I did get a Thunderberry here, which is nice. So Thunderberry is one of the best artifacts in the game. It's one of the legendary artifacts, so that's pretty cool. It's used for sprinting. But next we have the Arch artifacts. Every Arch artifact is different. I believe there's only 6, which is still quite a lot, but they're all in their own unique area with their own unique mechanics. So in the case of the weird nut, we have this ebb and flow mechanic with this like fiery tornado. And essentially what happens is as the tornado expands, you are not meant to platform, then you have to wait for the tornado to contract, and then you can platform to progress towards the artifact. And about halfway through, if you pursue it right away, I don't think there's enough time to get it, so you actually have to like reposition over here and wait for it to recede again before pushing in. But these are huge, dramatic, interesting things that produce an objectively good result, even if you just want to sell it. So Stalker 1 just doesn't really have things like this, where there's these like Arch artifacts, and it also doesn't have like this level of platforming either. And all of them require some degree of platforming or maneuvering around the map in an interesting way. So this one requires that if you fall, you'll die, so you have to be careful with managing where you're at. And also, you have to be careful when you approach it, because if it starts to expand and you're too late, or in some cases too early, you will start to burn down really quickly. And even as you grab it, you're kind of exposed to the flame there a little bit. So you might panic and, rush back and fall and die, which has happened to me a few times. So for the actual builds themselves, I have a magic cube. This is for a middle game build. So that it is in a lead container slot. So that is something that is managed because you want to make sure you're optimizing your containers. We have slime for some radio protection, increased durability. And then we have a Rat King, so it just has 3 positive effects that are all nice. And then we have a spring for carry capacity. So this is what an artifact build might look like in the early game or the middle game. And then I did get that Thunderberry, so I can swap out the Magic Cube for the Thunderberry, so I can switch tanking for sprinting in a single artifact slot. And I did have to pay quite a lot to get that lead container slot, so that is a pretty big investment, which is something that isn't really needed in Stalker 1. And then here's a more endgame build on an exosuit with 4 artifact or lead containers. We have a compass, we have a Night Star, we also have a liquid rock, we have a little bit of everything. So you can kind of see the difference between, the early to middle game build versus the end game build. There's more going on. In terms of artifact and build variety, this would definitely have to go to Stalker 2. There are simply more artifacts with more effects than there are artifacts in Stalker 1. And generally, the artifacts in Stalker 1 are of a certain category. So, for example, like the bleed reduction, or like the armor cap, or like the rupture cap, and so on. Whereas in Stalker 2, artifacts, for the most part, have drastically different properties, and they can interact with each other in terms of like the radiation cost in pretty interesting ways. There have been some pretty big updates. 1.5 rebalanced a lot of the artifacts, like Rat King is really good now, and some other artifacts have like double positive, triple positive effects with no downside. There's also, of course, the best artifacts, like the legendary artifacts and the Arch artifacts. The legendaries typically require a lead container or a liquid rock. But overall, I would say Stalker 2 has better artifacts than Stalker 1. Just the sheer variety of effects and of types of artifacts present in Stalker 2, as well as the Arch artifacts, I think it clearly goes to Stalker 2. And also the way that you get the artifacts is more compelling because you have to risk to get the reward. And in the case of Stalker 2, the artifact system I think is near perfect. The only thing I would change is I would make it so you can't get high-level artifacts and low-level spawns. But that is it for this one. Definitely like and subscribe if you enjoyed this or found this interesting, and I'll see you guys next one. Peace.